There's a valley in West Virginia where the children stopped speaking in 1923, not all at once, not like a plague. One by one, over the span of 18 months, 7 children from the same extended family simply went silent. Their mouths worked, their ears heard, but the words, those never came back. The doctors who examined them found nothing wrong, no disease, no injury, no explanation that made sense to anyone who believed the world operated on logic and reason alone. But the people in that valley, they knew. They'd always known. Some things in the blood don't wash clean, no matter how many generations you let pass. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. What I'm about to tell you isn't folklore. It's not legend dressed up as history. This is documented, recorded, buried in medical journals that haven't been digitized, in census records that tell a story nobody wanted to read, in family Bibles where the same 5 surnames appear over and over again, generation after generation, like a curse written in ink that never fades. The Latham family of Crenshaw Valley didn't just marry their neighbors. They married their cousins. And when the cousins ran out, they married their second cousins. And when people started whispering, they married in secret, in neighboring counties, under different names, always circling back to the same blood, the same names, the same hollow-eyed children born into a family tree that had long ago stopped branching. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Lathams had been intermarrying for over 140 years, and the valley had noticed. The children were different, pale in a way that seemed wrong, quiet in a way that felt like drowning, and then, in 1923, they stopped speaking altogether. What happened next wasn't salvation, it wasn't a cure. It was something far stranger, far darker, and it's been hidden from public record ever since. Until now. The Latham family came to Crenshaw Valley in 1779. 8 families total made that journey from the Tidewater region of Virginia, moving westward into land that didn't want them, into forests so thick the sun barely touched the ground. They were Quakers originally, or at least that's what the earliest records suggest, though by the time they settled in that valley, whatever faith they'd carried with them had twisted into something else entirely, something insular, something that didn't trust outsiders, didn't welcome new blood, didn't believe that salvation came from anywhere beyond the boundaries of their own land. Thomas Latham was the patriarch then, a hard man, by all accounts. He'd brought his wife Eleanor, his 4 sons, and his 3 daughters into that valley, and within 10 years, he'd married every single one of those children to someone from the other 7 families who'd made the journey with them: the Crenshaw family, the Morehouse family, the Pryors, the Webbs. By 1800, those 8 families had become so entangled that you couldn't draw a family tree anymore. You could only draw a web, and at the center of that web sat the Lathams, always the Lathams, pulling everyone back into their orbit. The valley itself seemed designed for isolation, surrounded by ridges on 3 sides, accessible only by a single dirt road that became impassable every winter. It was the kind of place where you could disappear and nobody would come looking. And that's exactly what the Lathams wanted. They built their homes close together, within shouting distance of each other, and they built their church in the center of it all. A small wooden structure with no denomination, no preacher from outside, just Thomas Latham standing at the pulpit every Sunday, reading from a Bible that had pages torn out. Pages, he said, didn't apply to them anymore. Pages about welcoming strangers, about loving thy neighbor as thyself. By 1820, the pattern was set. Latham sons married Latham cousins. Latham daughters married back into the Latham line. When a Webb or a Morehouse girl came of age, she married a Latham man, and her children carried the Latham name, the Latham blood, the Latham silence. Because even then, people noticed the children were quiet, unnaturally so. They didn't cry as infants the way other babies cried. They didn't laugh the way children should. They watched. They stared. And when they grew old enough to speak, their words came slow, deliberate, as if language itself was something foreign. By 1870, Crenshaw Valley had become a genetic echo chamber. The census records from that year tell a story that should have alarmed someone, anyone with authority or medical knowledge. But this was Appalachia, And these were people who didn't register their births on time, who didn't report their marriages to the county clerk, who existed in the margins of official record-keeping. Of the 43 families living in the valley, 31 shared direct blood relations with the Lathams. The remaining 12 families had already begun leaving, slowly, quietly, taking their children and their belongings in the middle of the night, as if fleeing something they couldn't name. The Latham children born in the 1870s showed the first unmistakable signs. There were reports, scattered through local doctors' notes and missionary journals, of children with unusual physical characteristics. Webbed fingers appeared in 3 separate births. A condition called microcephaly, where the skull doesn't develop properly, showed up twice. Twin girls born in 1876 both had eyes that couldn't track movement correctly, that seemed to stare past you rather than at you. But these weren't discussed. Not openly. When a traveling doctor visited the valley in 1878 and tried to examine some of the children, he was turned away at gunpoint. He wrote in his journal that the people of Crenshaw Valley had, quote, a fanatical devotion to privacy that borders on the pathological, and that he feared for the children he'd glimpsed, children who looked, in his words, as if they'd been carved from wax rather than born from flesh. The Lathams responded to these outside concerns not by opening up, but by closing ranks even tighter. In 1880, Joseph Latham, the great-great-grandson of Thomas, instituted what he called the Covenant. It wasn't written down, at least not in any document that survived, but everyone in the valley knew its terms. No Latham would marry outside the valley. No Latham would bring in foreign blood. No Latham would speak to outsiders about family matters. The punishment for breaking the covenant wasn't legal. It was social, complete shunning. Your name removed from the family Bible. Your children treated as if they didn't exist. And so the marriages continued. First cousins to first cousins became common. Uncle to niece marriages, while never explicitly acknowledged, appeared in the genealogical record with enough frequency that it couldn't be coincidence. By 1900, the Latham family tree had collapsed in on itself so completely that children were being born with 4 great-grandparents instead of 8, with 2 great-great-grandparents instead of 16. The blood had become concentrated, thick, and whatever genetic load that blood carried, whatever recessive traits and hidden mutations had been lurking in the Latham line since 1779, they were now expressing themselves in every single child born in that valley. The first child who stopped speaking was Sarah Latham. She was 6 years old in January of 1923. One morning she woke up, came down to breakfast, and when her mother asked her what she wanted to eat, Sarah opened her mouth and nothing came out. Not a whisper, not a sound. Her mother thought she was playing a game at first, the way children do, pretending to be mute for attention. But by nightfall, when Sarah still hadn't spoken, when she tried over and over again to form words and only produced silence, her mother knew something had broken inside her daughter, something that couldn't be fixed with discipline or prayer. The local doctor, a man named Edmund Croy who'd been serving Crenshaw Valley for 30 years, examined Sarah 3 times over the next week. He found nothing physically wrong with her vocal cords. Her tongue moved normally. Her hearing was perfect. She could understand everything said to her, could follow complex instructions, could even hum if asked to. But spoken language, actual words, those were gone. Dr. Croy noted in his records that Sarah seemed, quote, frustrated by her own silence, as if some vital connection between thought and speech had been severed. He referred to it as selective mutism, a psychological condition brought on by trauma. But Sarah's parents insisted nothing traumatic had happened. She'd simply woken up one day and the words were gone. 3 months later, it happened again. This time to Daniel Latham, Sarah's second cousin, age 8. Then to Rebecca Morehouse, who carried Latham blood on both sides of her family, age 7. Then to twins, Jeremiah and Judith Webb, both age 5, both going silent within hours of each other on the same June morning. By September of 1923, 5 children in Crenshaw Valley had lost the ability to speak. By December, it was 7, and the pattern was unmistakable. Every single child who went silent could trace their bloodline back through multiple Latham connections. Every single one was the product of at least 3 generations of cousin marriages. Every single one had parents who were themselves second or third cousins. Dr. Croy wrote to colleagues in Charleston, describing what he was witnessing. He used terms like hereditary neurological disorder and genetic regression. He suggested that the intermarriage had finally produced a breaking point, a biological consequence that could no longer be hidden or ignored. But his letters went unanswered. This was 1923. Eugenics was a respected science. Forced sterilization laws were being passed in state after state. The last thing anyone wanted was another example of what happened when bloodlines became too pure, too isolated. So Dr. Croy's letters were filed away, and Crenshaw Valley remained invisible to the outside world. The children themselves adapted in ways that disturbed everyone who witnessed it. They developed a system of communication that wasn't quite sign language, wasn't quite gesture. They would stare at each other, intensely, for long periods, and somehow understanding would pass between them. They moved in synchronization, as if connected by invisible threads. And they drew pictures, constantly, obsessively, always the same images. A tree with branches that grew inward instead of outward. A circle of children holding hands. And eyes. Always eyes. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, covering entire pages in charcoal and ink. By early 1924, word of the silent children had finally reached beyond the valley. Not through official channels, but through a schoolteacher named Margaret Finch, who'd taken a position in the nearby town of Carter's Mill and heard the stories from children who lived on the border of Crenshaw Valley. She wrote to the State Board of Health, describing what she'd heard as, quote, a medical emergency affecting multiple children, possibly an epidemic of unknown origin. That letter triggered something the Lathams had avoided for nearly 150 years. Outside intervention. In March of 1924, a team arrived. 3 doctors, 2 public health nurses, and a state investigator named Howard Brennan, whose job was to determine whether the children were being harmed through neglect or abuse. They came with official authorization, with legal documents that even Joseph Latham couldn't turn away at gunpoint. And what they found in those first few days shook every single one of them in ways they'd later struggled to articulate in their reports. The children were physically healthy, underweight by modern standards, but not starving, no signs of beating or physical abuse, but their behavior, their presence, was profoundly wrong. Dr. Samuel Warwick, a neurologist from Johns Hopkins who'd volunteered for the investigation, spent 6 hours with the 7 silent children. He wrote in his notes that they moved, quote, with an uncanny coordination, as if operating from a shared consciousness. When one child would reach for something, the others would turn to watch before the movement was fully completed. When one would draw, the others would add to the same image without any visible communication, and their eyes, Warwick noted, never seemed to blink at the same time. One child's eyes would close while another's opened, in a rhythm that felt deliberate, purposeful, as if they were taking turns keeping watch. The team began interviewing the families, tracing genealogies, documenting the marriage patterns that had defined Crenshaw Valley for generations. Nurse Catherine Wells, who'd worked in isolated communities before, was the one who finally pieced together the full scope of what had happened. She created a genealogical chart that showed, with brutal clarity, how concentrated the Latham bloodline had become. She calculated that the 7 silent children had, on average, only 12 unique great-great-great-grandparents instead of the 32 they should have had. In some cases, the same ancestor appeared 6 or 7 times in a single child's family tree. The blood hadn't just been kept in the family. It had been folded back on itself, over and over, until whatever genetic diversity had existed in 1779 had been almost completely eliminated. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. Dr. Warwick's conclusion, delivered in a preliminary report to the State Board of Health, was unambiguous. The children were suffering from what he termed, quote, a hereditary neurological condition resulting from extreme consanguinity. He recommended immediate intervention. He suggested that no further marriages should be permitted within the valley without genetic counseling, that the children should be removed and given specialized care, that the community itself should be monitored for additional cases. His report was clinical, careful, backed by data and observation, and it was immediately suppressed. Because 3 weeks after that report was filed, something happened that made everyone involved wish they'd never come to Crenshaw Valley at all. On April 19th, 1924, the 7 silent children disappeared, not in the way children run away or get lost in the woods. They were taken, deliberately, in the middle of the night, by their own families. By the time Dr. Warwick and his team arrived at the Latham homestead that morning, the main house was empty. The neighboring houses, empty. 12 families, 63 people in total, gone without a trace. They'd left behind furniture, clothing, family Bibles with pages torn out, and in the church at the center of the valley, a message written in what appeared to be lamp black across the whitewashed wall. 4 words, in letters 3 feet tall. You cannot break covenant. Howard Brennan, the state investigator, organized search parties immediately. They combed the ridges, followed every path leading out of the valley, checked with neighboring towns and counties. Nothing. It was as if 63 people had simply dissolved into the mountains. The few families who'd remained in Crenshaw Valley, the ones who weren't blood-tied to the Lathams, claimed they'd heard nothing, seen nothing. They were lying, of course. Everyone knew they were lying, but fear has a way of sealing mouths shut tighter than any oath. 3 months later, a farmer in Mercer County, over 80 miles south, reported something strange. He'd found children living in a cave system on his property. 7 children, all under the age of 10, all unable or unwilling to speak. They'd been surviving on foraged food, stream water, and what appeared to be supplies left for them by someone who visited at night. The farmer had tried to approach them, but they'd retreated deeper into the caves, moving together, always together, like a single organism, with 7 bodies. When the authorities arrived, they found the children gone again. But they found something else, drawings covering the cave walls, the same images the children had drawn in Crenshaw Valley, trees growing inward, circles of hands, and new images too, images of adults standing in darkness, watching, waiting. Over the next 2 years, there were sightings. The 7 children spotted in eastern Kentucky, in western North Carolina, in southwestern Virginia, always in remote areas, always living rough, always silent, and always, according to witnesses, there were adults nearby, adults who matched descriptions of Latham family members, adults who were keeping watch over the children but never quite making contact with them, as if maintaining some kind of ritual distance. The state police followed these reports, but they were always one step behind, arriving to find cold campsites and those same disturbing drawings left behind like breadcrumbs. Then, in August of 1926, the sightings stopped. Completely. No more reports of the silent children, no more traces of the Latham families who'd vanished with them. It was as if they'd found wherever they were going and had finally arrived. Dr. Warwick spent the rest of his career trying to follow up, writing letters to rural doctors across 5 states, asking if they'd seen children matching the descriptions, children who couldn't speak but communicated in other ways. He received 3 responses over 20 years. Each one described children who might have been the Latham 7. Each one noted that the children seemed healthy, seemed cared for, but lived completely outside normal society. And each one mentioned the same detail: the children's eyes, how they never seemed to blink at the same time, how they watched everything with an intensity that made grown men uncomfortable. Crenshaw Valley exists today, though you won't find it on most maps anymore. The name was changed in 1947 to Harmony Ridge, a piece of bureaucratic poetry meant to erase what had happened there, to bury the story under a more palatable fiction. The church, where that message was written, "You cannot break covenant," was torn down in 1952. The Latham homestead burned in 1963 under circumstances the fire marshal called suspicious but declined to investigate further. By 1970, only 8 families remained in what had once been a community of 43, and none of them carried the Latham name. The valley had been cleansed, officially, of the bloodline that had defined it for nearly 200 years. But genetic legacy doesn't disappear just because you burn down houses and change names on maps. In 1988, a graduate student in medical genetics named David Porter was researching hereditary speech disorders when he stumbled across Dr. Warwick's suppressed report in the Johns Hopkins archives. Porter became obsessed. He spent 3 years tracking down descendants of the families who'd lived in Crenshaw Valley, collecting DNA samples, building a database of genetic markers that appeared with unusual frequency in that isolated population. What he found confirmed Warwick's worst fears. The Latham bloodline carried multiple recessive mutations affecting neurological development, specifically in the areas of the brain responsible for speech production and social cognition. The children who'd gone silent hadn't been victims of trauma or psychological breakdown. They'd been expressing a genetic inevitability, the ultimate consequence of 144 years of breeding within an ever-shrinking circle. Porter's research was published in 1991 in obscure genetics journal. It attracted almost no attention, but it did attract one letter, postmarked from Eastern Tennessee, unsigned, written in careful handwriting that looked as if it had been practiced over and over until every letter was perfect. The writer claimed to be descended from the Latham line, claimed to know where some of the silent children had ended up, and claimed that the silence hadn't been a curse at all, but an evolution, that the children had developed other ways of communicating, other ways of understanding each other that went beyond language, that they'd formed communities in remote areas across Appalachia, small groups of people who shared that same genetic heritage, that same silence, that same uncanny coordination. The letter ended with a question that Porter never answered publicly, though it haunted him for the rest of his life. What if they weren't broken? What if they were becoming something else? There are still reports, if you know where to look. Rural doctors in Kentucky and West Virginia occasionally note cases of selective mutism in children from isolated communities, children whose family trees, when examined closely, show patterns of intermarriage spanning generations. Social workers in eastern Tennessee have documented small groups of adults who live communally, who rarely speak, who seem to operate with an eerie synchronization that makes outsiders deeply uncomfortable. And there are stories, whispered in the hollers and valleys where the tourists don't go, of people with the old bloodlines, people who can trace their ancestry back to those 8 families that settled Crenshaw Valley in 1779. People who watch you with eyes that don't blink at the right times, people who understand each other without words. The 7 children who disappeared in 1924 would be over 100 years old now, if any of them survived. Most likely, they're all dead, buried in unmarked graves somewhere in the mountains they fled to. But the genetics they carried, those mutations that silenced them, those still exist, still get passed down, still express themselves in children born into families that don't realize they're continuing a pattern that started 2.5 centuries ago. The Latham name might be gone from public records, scattered and changed and buried under generations of deliberate forgetting. But the blood, that concentrated, folded, recursive blood, that's still out there, still circling back on itself, still producing children who don't speak the way other children speak, who don't see the world the way other people see it. And sometimes, late at night, in valleys where the cell phone signal doesn't reach and the old ways still hold power, you can find drawings on rock faces and cave walls, trees growing inward, circles of children holding hands, and eyes, always eyes, watching from the darkness, waiting for something the rest of us will never understand. The Lathams kept their covenant. They just kept it somewhere we stopped looking, somewhere we convinced ourselves didn't exist anymore. But it does. It always has. And it's still waiting, patient and silent, in the places where bloodlines run too pure and the children learn to speak in ways that have nothing to do with words. If this story disturbed you the way it disturbed me, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think happened to those 7 children. Tell me if you've ever heard similar stories from your own family history, from valleys and hollers where people don't talk about what happened generations ago. And if you want more stories like this, stories that uncover the dark truths buried in American history, make sure you're subscribed, because there are more valleys out there, more families, more secrets that someone decided we were better off not knowing. But we're going to find them anyway, one story at a time.